All right, we are live. Thank you for joining us today. Today I am joined by Mel from the Origins channel. Looks into the historical origins of Islam, kind of putting aside the standard narrative and asking, what do we actually know historically? Perhaps when we dive into the history, we'll discover that the Muslim historical sources are pretty accurate. That's a reasonable starting position. But when we actually look at it, we found something very different. And Mel's going to be talking a little bit about that today. Let me go ahead and open us with a quick word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time together. We thank you for the technology that allows us to connect with fellow Christians, but also non-Christians from all around the world. We pray that this stream will reach many Muslim minds, that they will not just dismiss what we have to say, but will ask these important questions. If Islam is actually true, then they have nothing to be afraid of. And if the historical narrative has been invented and is false, then they should want to know that as well. In principle, they should want to get back to the original teachings of Islam, if such a thing really exists. And if Islam proves to be completely false, then they should want to know that and find a different religion that is true. We pray that people approach the material with an open mind, whether they are Christians, Muslims, or otherwise, and not simply dismiss what we have to say. We ask that you be with us today, that you guide our discussion and prevent us from grave theological error. We ask that anything that we say that is true and useful be remembered and applied, and anything that we say that is false is simply forgotten. We ask these things in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. As I said, I'm joined by Mel, and I'm going to give him some time to introduce himself, tell us a little bit about what he does on YouTube.
Okay, so I'm Mel. I'm originally Mel of Sneakers Corner, but I started a new channel recently called Origins. I thought the name was more fitting. In fact, the name that should be underneath me there should actually say Origins, not Origin. But yeah. So the key aim of my channel is basically to delve into the origins of Islam. I don't accept the standard Islamic narrative, or sin as it is often known as. And what I'm asking are just basic evidential questions, which is, okay, if the narrative says this, does that correspond to what we find in historical sources? And what typically happens is we find contradictions. And these contradictions should not be happening, because if the narrative is true, we should see a consistent message in the general narrative, the general evidence from history from the time. But what we find is no matter what angle or area that we look at, we constantly come up with contradictions, and it doesn't make sense. And this phrase, "it doesn't make sense," is something that we'll hear a lot today, because we're going to see lots of examples of how things don't make sense. So without further ado, I'm going to just share my slides here.
And I will say that we will open up the stream for any Muslim responses towards the end after the presentation. We welcome any feedback, any criticism. This is how we get towards truth, is by this feedback cycle. So when no one comes up and no one's willing to defend Islam, well, that tells us something, but it doesn't really tell us that our arguments are bad. What it tells us is that Muslims are afraid of our arguments. And as I said in the prayer, anyone should be pursuing truth, and that's all we ask. So, Mel has changed his opinion on Islamic history many times, and I'm sure he's open to change his mind again if you bring good evidence. And empty rhetoric, that's not going to do you any good. But if you have solid evidence, you have solid arguments, we'd love to hear them.
Absolutely. So just to give a little bit of background, I've got 3 channels currently. There are 2 which cover the new videos, one on Rumble and one on YouTube, and the links are on display there. And then all my previous videos are backed up on Odyssey. Okay, so if you haven't subscribed to any of those, please do after this, or you can do it right now. I will be using hash words, I think that's how you call them, to to make it easier for people to find the videos, for example, if you want to find out about the Dome of the Rock, any videos that I produce will have that hash name. And okay, so that's just that bit out of the way, so you know where to find all the videos. Let me see. So this phrase, if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. This is Judge Judy Scheindlin. A friend of mine told me about this the other day. I never noticed her saying this when I used to watch her, but actually her phrase is the result of years of hearing cases and having to sit through blatant lies. And, you know, how do you judge if someone is telling a lie? Well, you could probably look at their body language and maybe their shifty eyes, their ums, their ahs, things like that. But another obvious giveaway is the fact that their story doesn't make sense. There's contradictions in the story. Things don't make logical sense and that kind of thing. So I'm going to be using that as a general principle. When we look at whether it be Hadiths, Sirahs, or whatever, anything that comes from the Islamic narrative, if it doesn't make sense, I would suggest that it's not true. Okay? Feel free to interrupt me at any stage here. So how much do Muslims believe in Islamic narratives? Now, Muslims vary, of course, but Muslims by and large believe in wholeheartedly the narratives of Islam and in its theological message. Some Muslims, realizing that the Hadiths and Sirah are mostly bogus, are Quran-only Muslims, but even there, they're still accepting some of the narrative, i.e. that a book was transmitted to Muhammad through an angel from Allah. So even if we say them at a minimum, Muslims who are Quran only, they still can't avoid depending on some of these hadiths, because how else do they explain what book they have in front of them? They have some interpretive key to understanding the book, which is essentially a bunch of hadiths that they rely on, whether consciously or unconsciously, to help them make sense of the book that's in front of them.
Yeah, I think you often find that Muslims will say they reject something, but it's more because it's embarrassing than they've come to any, solid historical conclusion that this isn't true. And then they say that, but they really kind of still accept it. Even people who will claim to be Quranists and they only follow the Quran, well, then they tell you about a bunch of things that they believe that are not found in the Quran. You basically can't tell anything about Muhammad from the Quran, but they still say, Muhammad's the messenger of God, blah, blah, blah. So it's not really a consistent position. There are plenty of Muslims, like you said, most who accept everything, but that's because they haven't really looked into anything. Once they start to look into things, it's, I reject that, I reject this, I reject that. And then they don't follow that through to the conclusion. They just reject things that are embarrassing to them, as opposed to actually saying what's historically true and what isn't.
Yeah, and there's also this phenomenon that I've noticed, particularly online, where even after you've disproved some point about Islam, come the next video, they're back stating the same thing again, as if the discussion you've just had has never happened. It's like it's complete restart. It's a bit like starting a new game in a video game. Where you get a new life, you start again. So I don't understand that mentality, because I think if you're honest about your discussions, if someone proves a point, you gotta accept that. You can't just say, "Well, I'll just forget what that person has just said and start asserting a false statement again."
Absolutely.
So, in my view, this may be a little bit controversial, but I think believing in the narratives places you already halfway to becoming a Muslim. Okay, so I think, and unfortunately this is in my way, one second, believing the narratives are true puts you sort of halfway. Obviously there's parts of it that you may not accept, like for example that the revelation comes from Allah, but Muslims want you to believe their stories at the very least. If you don't believe the stories, you're over here, but at the moment you start believing any of the stories, you're already on your way to becoming a Muslim. You may not believe that you're on your way to become a Muslim, but it's surprising how, if you look at the story of how people converted to Islam, what normally has happened is they first delve into Islam, they read the stories, they start to believe the stories. They believe the stories are true, and then lo and behold, ends up becoming Muslim. And now I don't know if you recognize this woman here in the picture.
I do not.
No,
It's a little small.
She's a famous Irish singer called Sinead O'Connor. She is a bit of how will I say this delicately? She's got mental health issues. We'll put it that way. But at one stage, she had become a priest, and then she gave that one up, and then she became a Muslim without any sense of logic at all. But she obviously her path that led her from one to the other would have been reading the story of Muhammad, being infatuated by the story, and then slowly but surely got indoctrinated with the doctrine of Islam, wasn't able to probably come up with a response to that doctrine, and therefore just imbibed it and became Muslim as a result.
Yeah, that's a really good point you had there, that Muslims want us to take the historical narrative for granted, because then they're already, good ways towards Islam being true if the narrative's true. Some critics say, I'm just going to take the narrative for granted because there's plenty of stuff to criticize with even in the historical narrative, which is certainly true. But at the same time, you're kind of giving up ground. You're saying that we're accepting these things as true, at least, for the purpose of argument. And then you've prevented them from having to argue for all this stuff. They've already got you halfway, like you said.
Yeah, that's the thing. You've just given a lot of ground just by accepting it. I would also say that even if you don't think the revelation was from God, just by accepting that the events and characters are real, you've already been successfully groomed by this ideology and primed for its later full acceptance. So, brainwashing is not something new. It's been going on for centuries. Rulers have used it. They've used propaganda to get the general public to believe a certain view on things, and this was very useful because you could get your soldiers, for example, to believe that a war is justified, and you could motivate them to be willing to die for an ideological cause rather than for anything that's in their personal self-interest. So those that know what they're doing, they know really how to groom people through ideology, and it's a very powerful tool, especially when you're trying to create an Islamic empire where the people in it don't have anything in common because they all come from different countries, and the only thing that brings them together is the ideology. And I'm very persuaded by the point of view that Islam is primarily a political ideology rather than a religion. I think that's something that our friend Lloyd de Young would argue as well. So having said that, all I'm saying here really is be careful of narratives that reframe your sense of reality. You may have moral, logical, or theological objections, and we have loads of those, that will ward you off from taking the last step. But there are countless cases of people getting suckered into this cult who started out skeptical. There are also cases of ex-Muslims who relapse back into Islam precisely because, despite the absurdities, a part of their brain still thinks that it is grounded in reality. So that's where I'm coming at. So what I'm really saying here is just use your common sense, use your prudence. Don't get too suckered in by these stories. Always keep your skeptical mind going. By all means, I would say use Islamic sources when debating Muslims, but use them ironically, not as someone who puts any credence in them. You don't actually have to believe in them in order to argue with Muslims, because all you're doing is you're arguing on their own premises and showing up the absurdities of their logic. And I think that's a good way of arguing. In fact, I would say it's much better to argue with Muslims on this ground than it is to try and argue from the historical critique ground, because it requires a lot more knowledge of what actually went on historically in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century. But at the very least, if you are going to argue using Islamic sources, protect yourself against accidentally getting suckered into the ideology by keeping a skeptical mind about all of this.
Yeah, what I like to do is, make the critique based on their sources. But then as soon as they start saying, that's not true, that's not reliable, whatever, and say, well, I agree all your sources are fake, but you need to understand what that means. That means that your religion's based on a bunch of people who were supposedly telling lies according to you, and follow that through to its conclusion. Don't just stop and say this one thing I don't like is false. See what else is false. So, start with the from their point of view, and then as soon as they start to reject things, be like, yes, I'd reject them too. I don't think they're true. But you got to keep going. You can't just stop right there and reject what you want.
Absolutely. I love David Wood's line, according to Islam's most reliable sources. That phrase should be learned by every polemicist that argues with Islam, because there's so much in that. If Islam's most reliable sources are shown to be either false or absurd, what does that tell you about Islam? It obviously means that there's a massive hole in the narrative, and therefore there's tons of questions to be answered, and possibly just proves that Islam is false. So I would say, don't buy into their narratives. The Hadiths and the Sirah, again, I'm being controversial here, are a gateway drug into Islam. They are designed to capture your imagination to such an extent that you think they are true. When I hear some Christians trying to argue that Muhammad was just hallucinating, had a dream, or was lying, I worry for them. They have already bought the bait. So they're arguing within the narrative rather than arguing from outside the narrative. So now you can argue within the narrative, but just be aware that you should always be constantly doing it ironically, not necessarily accepting it. I think the nearest would be if you're discussing a movie that's clearly fictional, and you're pointing out the holes in the plot line. I think that's sort of the level at which you should be thinking of this. Islam today has got one standard sirah on which it bases itself. Would you agree with that one?
Maybe.
Maybe.
they have so many, but you're right. Current Muslims, they mostly ascribe to the sacred nectar, the narrative found in that, which has been cleaned and recycled, and has very little to do with all of the other sirahs that came before it.
Yeah. So I think this is something that's relatively new to me. This is something that Lloyd has pointed out, and it will be something that will be pointed out later on P-Fander films. What people don't realize is there were over 50 different sirahs, and way back in the 19th century, it was a German scholar who decided that Ibn Hisham's sirah is going to be the standard one. He's not a Muslim, by the way. He chose that was the one that they're going to work with, and so Islam fell in line. And that was, from then onwards, that was the only surah that was being referred to. So that's quite a situation to be in. These each have a different story about Muhammad. To what extent they're different needs to be investigated, but potentially there could be lots of contradictions and differences between the stories. The current narrative was chosen arbitrarily from amongst them. This is a rabbit hole that if we go down will just get worse and worse for Islam's claims. And I think this would be something well worth exploring in the coming year. I'd love to bring on Lloyd to talk about this, because I know he knows quite a lot about the sirahs and the differences, but I think this would be highly embarrassing for Islam. Okay. Now, if that isn't bad enough, there are also multiple Arabic Qurans. I'm sure most of our viewers know all about that. There are 30 plus different Qurans in Arabic. In this context, does it make any sense to say the Quran was preserved, let alone perfectly preserved? It doesn't make sense. Any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, well, these lines have been crafted specifically for propaganda purposes. If they'd made a perfectly reasonable claim that, the original story is largely preserved, that it doesn't affect to substantial degree any doctrine, the same kind of things that Christians say, that 99% of the texts we're pretty sure is original, then they'd be fine. But instead they create this propaganda. They create this propaganda that it's perfectly preserved right down to the letter, and then you go and look and you're like, that's not true. And because of this propaganda, they don't have a text critical version of the Quran. So they actually don't know how much of it is corrupted. They don't know how much is uncertain. So when I say it's probably, comparable to the Bible, I don't really know that, because no one's done the text critical research, because the propaganda is more important than the words of their supposed God.
Yeah. I think the text critical version of the Quran is on the way, as far as I know. I think it's what was it called? Corpus Coranus. I think it's a German organization. Do you know it?
I'll just say it's about time, because every work of ancient history, even things that are only known from 3 manuscripts, have a text critical version.
Yeah, I know that Professor Angelica knew it in Germany. I think she's on top of that. She's working on it. I think it's Corpus Coranus, something on those lines. I may be wrong, but if anyone knows, you can correct me. I believe that's what it's called, but they're working on that. And that's going to basically harpoon the idea that the Quran was perfectly preserved. And I do totally agree. If they had made a lesser claim, if they just said it's the gist of what was there originally, then that would be fine. But to say it's perfectly preserved is patently false. To make things worse, about 20% of the text is also unintelligible to the modern Arabic speaker. Large parts of the Quran literally, don't make sense. So that's another problem. And this is probably got to do with the fact that in the early days, the Quran was essentially a kind of a hybrid between Aramaic and Arabic, representing a local dialect of Arabic in either Syria or Iraq. And, the population has moved away from that particular dialect, and they're left with a text that no longer makes sense. And then there's the issue of the diacritical marks and where they place them in the text, which has messed up the understanding of the text. So you can place the dots in different locations, and you have a totally different text, meaning the meaning being different and so on. So there's a lot of problems there with that. Considering that the narrative tells us that the Quran was given to basically clear up the mess from the earlier scriptures, this doesn't bode well. If this is Allah's best attempt to clear up all the corruption from the Old Testament and the New Testament, well, this is not the way to go about it. I would have thought that Allah would, in his wisdom, have waited till there was a stable language with a stable lettering system, and then that would be a good time to introduce a Quran, not deliver something before a script has been even invented properly. It's the worst possible way of bringing a revelation to mankind. I don't know if you want to talk on that.
Yeah, well, contrast this to the New Testament, written in Koine Greek, a well-established language with hundreds of texts written in the language from before the time the New Testament came to be. And then you get the Quran coming along, and it's not literally the first work in written Arabic, but it's while the language is still developing, especially while the script is still developing. And it's a very odd choice. If this is, the revelation for all humanity of all time, that it's written in a language that's still evolving, and 100 years after it's written, people probably won't fully understand what was written anymore. Very strange stuff.
Yeah, and then another aspect of this, which I'm not really going into today, is the fact that it's not pure Arabic. It has got Aramaic, it's got Ethiopic, and Hebrew, and probably some Greek words as well. So even as an attempt to be an Arabic scripture, it doesn't really achieve that. And again, if we go back to what we said at the beginning, if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. So I would suggest the Quran, in terms of it's supposedly being a revelation from Allah, that this is simply not true. It doesn't make sense. The general narrative of Muhammad is so obviously false that it amazes me that anyone buys it. And we'll have a look at that in a second. Again, if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. We're told an illiterate man was the source of a book that has all the telltale signs of literary sourcing. Now, that's an area that you've looked at a lot, and you've done a number of videos of all of the various books and sources for the Quran. Does it make sense that someone who can't read or write would somehow have a book with all of these sources in it?
No. Well, I mean, you can orally pass on stories. You know, the Muslims use this as a defense. They're like, well, he was illiterate, so he must have gotten this revelation directly from God. But of course, even if we assume that he's illiterate, that, you know, you can orally pass on stories. But the reality is Muhammad probably wasn't illiterate, you know, or whoever was the creator of the Quran probably wasn't. Even if we take the standard narrative and we look at who he was supposed to be, he's a commercial trader, and he's traveling large swaths of land, a trade that would normally be literate. Plus, the word translated as unlettered doesn't really mean that. It probably Ummi is the word. It probably means outsider, Gentile, if you will. It probably has not, so this is probably a good example of something that developed later on in response to polemics. The same things that are in the Quran, you know, people accusing him of copying sources. Eventually, they came up with this defense. Well, he couldn't have copied sources because he was illiterate. In other words, it's totally made up.
Plus, there's also, it's very convenient that the story is that he's illiterate because it misdirects people away from where the book likely came from, which is Iraq, Syria, you know, up in the north, by placing him down in Mecca as a literate man in an obvious desert where there is no access to any of these sources. This is a brilliant defense. So the fallback then is simply, well, it could only have occurred because he got a revelation from Allah. But the obvious evidence is that there are sources being borrowed, and this is probably not just the work of one person, but a community of people who are basically piecing together the community's scripture, as it were, collectively. And even if it's done imperfectly, as it actually is done imperfectly, but it's certainly not the work of someone who's illiterate, and also in an area where these sources would not be found. So I think that's a massive hole in that story. And I would suggest moving Muhammad north isn't enough to fix this. The story of where these texts come from is complex, and we need to turn to the work of Odin Lafontaine and Thomas Alexander from Inara to get the key insights. But unless Christians want to believe Muhammad got a divine revelation, then we need to stop repeating the standard Islamic narrative and learn how it really came about and what its purpose was. So I would say a good starting point would be to identify the sources, and then kind of come to the conclusion, well, actually, we don't need a revelation to explain the book. It's fully explained by just looking at the sources which are found in Syria and Iraq and so forth.
Yeah, and I'll add the good thing about the sources is they're hard data. This actually gives us something to look at. When you see two things that are very similar, you know that one borrowed from the other, and in many cases we know definitively that the source that the Quran used came well before it, so it couldn't be copying from the Quran. But this gives us some hard data. This gives us something to really look at, as opposed to just kind of looking at it and trying to think in your mind, well, I think it probably worked this way. I mean, not that that's not valuable, but it's best to start with the hard data. And I think the source texts are probably a great place to start.
So the next part that I'm going to look at is kind of like a chicken and egg type issue. So just imagine in the 7th century, Muhammad was supposed to have told his followers that you must wear t-shirts and shorts. Okay, bit ridiculous. Okay, now let's say we look at sources of how, well, let's say supposed Muslims are dressed in the 8th century. What would you expect in the 8th century if you were to assume that the Hadiths about Muhammad saying that his followers should wear t-shirts and shorts? What would you expect?
I would think you'd see pictures of them in t-shirts and shorts.
That would be fairly logical. So what we find, and I've got a few examples of this, is that we have hadiths that are supposed to have originated from the 7th century, where Muhammad teaches his followers very clear things about what should be done and what shouldn't be done. And then when we look at later times, we don't see any sign that these are instructions that are even known about, let alone followed. And I think that makes a very strong argument for the fact that these hadiths are literally fictions that were created later and backdated to make it look like he taught this. And this could be because at later times they wanted Muhammad's backing for some particular ideological position that they held, and they want to use him to make people follow that sort of teaching. Okay, so let's have a look at this here. These false narratives are immediately contradicted by historical sources. According to the Sarcen, Muhammad banned alcohol supposedly in the 7th century. But if that were true, why are the Umayyads sending wine cups to the Chinese in the 8th century? Now, just to check that I'm not bluffing everyone watching, have you heard that Muhammad banned alcohol? Is that something I've made up, or is that in the standard Islamic narrative?
Well, that's certainly in the standard narrative. The Quran seems to be a little ambiguous about this. It seems to say that's banned, but also not. And then of course, the Muslim suggestion is that the one that says it's not banned was earlier and that was abrogated. But if we look at the early Muslims, perhaps they have a different opinion than current Muslims.
Yeah. So this is what a Chinese source has said. Pardon me. I won't read the Chinese. I'll leave that to the Chinese members of the audience. But receiving invoice, presenting golden silk woven robe, jewelry decorated jade, and luxurious wine cup as tribute from the king of Dashi, named Hemi Moni. Now, the key thing here is the Dashi are otherwise known as the Tayyaye, and they ruled in Iraq, essentially. So they would have been Muslims, okay? They would have been the Umayyad leaders, essentially, okay? And the year that this happened was 716, 717 AD. So we're talking 100 years, supposedly, into the Islamic era. Now, the fact that the king of the Muslims, if we can call them Muslims, we can call the tribe the Tayyaye, but they're supposed to be Muslims. They're sending a luxurious wine cup. Now, is that consistent with the idea that they don't drink alcohol and despise alcohol and are against alcohol?
No, not really.
No, I think that's a clear indication that there's a mismatch between the narrative and actually what used to go on in the 8th century. Now, when I first saw this, I thought, well, maybe this is just a one-off anomaly, but really, you should be finding other evidence that is consistent with the standard Islamic narrative in the 8th century, but this is not what I've found the more I've delved into it. So we'll look at some more examples, and this is not exhaustive, but there are plenty of examples we could choose from. I want to just make this point before we go there. The messianic machine creates narratives in order to create a new religion. This is kind of an explainer, a primer for what's going on here. New mythologies and narratives are created whenever the existing religions reach an impasse. The old narratives no longer work, and the only way forward is a new narrative. So that's my explanation for why all of these hadiths and sirahs are created. For whatever reason, the people who are directing things, the elite, they find that they can't use the Jewish religion for their purposes. They can't use Christianity, so they need to come up with something new, with a new narrative to fit what they're trying to achieve, and that's the impetus behind all of this. These narratives are bundles of ideas given by people in authority, and they are trusted. People put the ideas on like new clothes and accept them on the basis of that trust. What matters is trust and authority, not necessarily truth. Because it's people in authority, they just assume, well, if they've told us these stories, they must be true. And a couple of generations pass, and then it's too late for anyone to spot that it's a lie. People open a door, walk through, and now they are in a parallel universe, divorced from reality, with a fake history that forms their communal memory. And from then onwards, that is their idea of what happened previously. So, back to some examples. We are also told that hadiths were collected in which Muhammad banned all images of people. I'm sure you've heard that one. Yeah?
Yes.
It's a very common one. You hear said by Muslims today, Muhammad especially doesn't want his own image painted, but people in general should not be painted.
Yeah, it's interesting, actually, that they've kind of transformed this in modern times to be just images of Muhammad, pretty much. Maybe other prophets, but mostly just images of Muhammad. All these Muslims have YouTube channels where they appear on camera. They're making images of human beings. So they've kind of abandoned the idea that no human being can be pictured.
Yeah, unfortunately, technology has made it, what's the word for it, inconvenient to have a hadith like this. So this would be a hadith that really they would have wanted to get rid of, if they had a crystal ball and they knew the way technology was going to go. But apparently, Sahih Muslim, Volume 3, number 5268, says, Ibn Umar reported Allah's Messenger having said, those who paint pictures would be punished on the day of resurrection, and it would be said to them, breathe soul into what you have created. Okay, so that's kind of fairly black and white there. If you paint pictures, you'll be punished on the day of resurrection. Did such an idea exist in the 7th century? Well, that's the big question. The Hadiths say that idea existed, but I doubt it, considering the caliphs of the 8th century had no reluctance about depicting people in their palaces, including naked ones.
Oh, wow.
And I'm going to show you the evidence here. This is straight from a palace of the caliph. So I would suggest where we're going with all of this is this just proves that this hadith is from a much later time, and it's trying to backdate it to Muhammad's time. So let's have a look. So this is from the Qusair Amra in the Jordan, and this is from the 730s. And this is a depiction. I'm not sure if it's a woman or a man. Some people say it's a woman, some say it's a man. But bathing in a very lewd way, with onlookers in the background, and certainly not something you would expect 100 years after supposedly the beginning of Islam. So if Muhammad had said you're not allowed to paint pictures, particularly naked pictures of people, how come the caliphs are quite happy to do that just 100 years later? Now, these are the leaders of Islam. So in the 8th century, try and get your head around these. In the 8th century, supposed Muslim leaders have got people drawing pictures of naked people in their palaces. Does that make sense?
It certainly does not if that hadith comes from Muhammad.
Absolutely. So there's that hadith again. And here's another picture from the palace, and this is in the audience hall. So it's not that this is like a private stash. This is something that would have been shown to the public. It is not conceivable that such hadiths pre-existed when the caliphs were having paintings like this done in their audience halls. This doesn't represent just what the caliphs considered culturally acceptable, but also what was tolerable for the society of the time. So you could argue, okay, there are sometimes weird caliphs that go against society and they have these anomalies, but this is in an audience hall where visitors from all over the land would have come. And if Muhammad really had banned images of people and they were to invite the elite into these audience halls, probably what would have happened is within minutes the caliph would have got beheaded because he's defied Muhammad, if this hadith really existed. I think this is pretty solid evidence that this hadith was not yet written in the 8th century and is purely fiction from later times.
And I'll point out that this lady's face is clearly visible. So you see the later pictures, they will often draw the body, but they won't draw the face. So you can't even say, well, oh, they just didn't draw her face. I mean, you clearly see eyes and nose, mouth there. It's clearly a face.
Absolutely, yeah. So they have, and there's lots of examples of this. So this is utterly spurious, the Hadiths, made up centuries later, possibly as late as the time of the Ottomans, so way later. So there's your Hadith again. Yet all these clearly ahistorical Hadiths with spurious chains of narration are just as spurious as each other. The idea that some are Sahih is just another trick to buttress what are later fabrications. So this is another little trick, is they rank their Hadiths, even though all of them are equally spurious and made up, by saying that certain ones are Sahih and others are Daif and all the rest of it. This again is pulling the wool over our eyes, and they allow themselves a fallback position, so that if someone really challenges a Hadith as being false, they can say, well, that isn't Sahih, that's from a less reliable chain of narration, and it's all nonsense. It's an excuse essentially for why a Hadith is clearly fake.
Yeah, it's interesting if you look at some of the hadith that are in, not in the Sahih collections, that are just in other works. The chain won't go all the way back to companion, and they probably reflect when the practice actually began. The 100 years later or whatever. That's as far back as the chain goes. And then later they backfilled all these other stuff to make it go back to Muhammad. So that's probably when they really started to collect these, is maybe 100 years after, at the earliest.
Yeah, I would say that they were just as imaginative when it comes to their chain of narration, and all of these people that they used for this chain of narration are figments of their imagination as much as the stories themselves. These are very creative people. These people, had they lived in the 21st century, would have been script writers for movies, and their storylines would have been pretty good, and they would have had a good plot line, and they would have thought of every little detail. But they're not perfect, and when you delve into them, you soon start seeing flaws in them, which is a sign that they're simply not true.
And I'll also add that, Muslims say, well, there's a whole science. We know that so-and-so had a bad memory and blah, blah, blah. Well, once a chain becomes accepted, once a particular chain is Sahih, you just attach that same chain to whatever you want to be Sahih, and problem solved.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what most historians think happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So another example of a hadith that has the telltale signs of a very late invention is the following. Abu Martad al-Ganawi reported Allah's messenger as saying, "Do not pray facing towards the graves and do not sit on them." Sahih Muslim, book 4, number 2122. Okay, so according to this hadith, you're not allowed to pray facing the grave, and you're not allowed to sit on them. Now, this might surprise you, but I would suggest that this was invented sometime between the 14th and the 18th century AD, most likely the 18th century AD. Okay, so this is again just more examples of later fabrications, and we'll see why now in just a moment. Okay, so
before you go on, I wanted to read this interesting comment from Marion here. Everything that's needed to invent and create what is needed to make a society move forward is forbidden, though. And that's actually an interesting point, that, like forbidding making pictures, for example, forbidding innovation, bid'ah. It's kind of like the people who were creating this were like, we know what we're doing, we're creating something wholesale, and someone else can just do the same thing later, so let's create rules that forbid you from inventing things.
Yes, they want to have the benefit of making things up, but they also want to close the door later so that it doesn't get way out of hand. They want to keep some control over this, and it's partially because they know that once you start telling lies, eventually it's going to expose itself.
Absolutely.
So, just to get back to what we're talking about here, is that, of according to this hadith, Muslims are not allowed to face towards the grave or to sit on them, and it's basically, it's against Islam, okay? And we're expected to believe that this comes from the time of Muhammad. Now, again, like what we mentioned about the t-shirts and shorts, if this was really something that was said by Muhammad and it was, eventually written down as a hadith, we wouldn't expect any traditions of people visiting graves, facing them, or even praying to Muhammad in his grave or anything like that. I think that's fairly reasonable, because devout Muslims would just simply not do that, because if Muhammad said it, that's enough. It certainly wouldn't exist. We definitely wouldn't see it happening in prime locations in Islam, like, for example, Medina, right? If there's one place where this would not happen, if such a hadith existed, we definitely wouldn't expect it to happen at Medina. But unfortunately, that's exactly what we find, okay? This is a picture from the, I believe it's either the 19th century or maybe early part of the 20th century. So these are mausoleums in Medina. There's big ones and small ones, and basically this was a place where Muslims used to visit, and they used to pray to Muhammad and all the various other people supposedly buried there, okay? And it existed for at least 1,000 years, and it only got destroyed in the 19th and 20th century. Now, why I say 19th and 20th? Because it got destroyed, rebuilt, and then destroyed again. And this was due to when Wahhabism took over. An-Nawawi, from the 13th century, in the section devoted to visiting Muhammad's grave, says, "The visitor stands and greets the Prophet. Then he uses the Prophet as his means in his innermost self and seeks his intercession." Did you see the problem? So supposedly Muhammad said you're not allowed to face the grave, to sit on it, or to visit it, and all that kind of stuff. And yet here we have a practice of people praying to Muhammad, okay? So the takeaway here is clearly this practice existed before the hadith was created to outlaw it. So you have to have a practice in order to outlaw it. If the law is put into place through the hadith, then the practice would supposedly stop. But we have this practice that has occurred for 1,000 years. That is not feasible if Muhammad had banned it from the start. It would just never have taken off. Now, when we look at the sequence of events, we can see when the hadith was invented, i.e. the 18th century. So, Ibn Jubair in 1145-1217, he describes the beautiful mausoleums in Medina. That shows that they existed way back. Then An-Nawawi in the 13th century describes how visitors to Muhammad's grave prayed to him, seeking his intercession before Allah. So again, both of these is evidence that there's no hadith forbidding this. Then Ibn Taymiyyah comes along in the 13th century. He denounces the visitation of Muhammad's grave. So he's the first basically to denounce it. And his ideas are so out of whack with the rest of the Muslim population that he actually ends his days in prison for being a radical. So they don't accept his teaching. Now, if the hadith had existed, he would have been fated as being someone who's supporting Muhammad's true hadiths, but that is not what happened. He was thrown into prison and he spent his last days behind bars. Now, if you turn to the 18th century, 1703 to 1792, Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the founder of Wahhabism, he takes up Ibn Taymiyyah's ideas again and creates a movement. So where that red arrow is where I would suggest the beginning of that hadith was created, sometime in the 18th or possibly the 19th century, in line with the beginnings of Wahhabism. In 1806 and again in 1925, following nearer reconstruction, the Wahhabis destroyed the mausoleums in Medina. Only Muhammad's grave was spared. So I would suggest that sometime between the 18th and 19th century, these hadiths were created to discourage the visiting of graves. But for 1,000 years, this practice had been going on. So the Hadiths must have been late, very late. Just it goes to show, again, the fakery that's going on. Do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really bold claim by you to say that a hadith was added to Sahih Muslim in the 18th century. I mean, if you could prove this, you could. It would be devastating because this is one of it generally considered the second best collection behind Sahih Bukhari, but certainly one of the canonical collections. And Muslims could easily disprove you if they had a text critical edition.
Yes.
Same problem with the Quran. We really don't know. I mean, I'm sure that someone somewhere kind of knows the manuscripts of the Hadith collections, but really they're not readily available. The manuscript history isn't readily available. The manuscript history of the Quran isn't readily available, and this is a big red flag, right?
It is, yeah.
Who's hiding something? Every other document, whether it's a Christian text, a secular text, whatever, every document from before the time of the printing press that is of any significance whatsoever, there's text critical editions, and scholars analyze them and they try to determine the original writing. And I think what's going to happen is if there ever is a text critical version of Sahih Muslim, since that's what you're talking about, they're going to find that not all these hadith are original. They're going to have 1 John 5:7 situations that Muslims love to point out. Oh, someone added that text to it. Well, someone added entire hadiths to the Sahih collections.
Yeah, I've heard that Al-Bukhari is the earliest full copy of Al-Bukhari is from the 19th century. So I stand corrected.
Wow! Even the 19th century. So even when the printing press was invented, they still don't have complete copies for another couple hundred years.
Yeah, so I think it would be a great question to throw back at Muslims and say, right, tell us when we actually have a verifiable first edition of Ibn Hisham, or the earliest edition of Ibn Hisham, entire Sirah. Give us your earliest Muslim Sirah, or collection of hadiths. Give us your earliest Al-Bukhari and so forth. It'd be very interesting to see what dates to come up with. I would suggest an awful lot of it is fraudulent and that the dates are not accurate. But the onus is on them to prove that they are as early as they claim to be. But I would suggest that where it's heading, the evidence, I haven't seen the full evidence yet, but the evidence certainly would indicate to me that an awful lot of the hadiths, I can't give you a percentage just yet because obviously it's just, these are just hints at what the truth is, but I would say the majority of the hadiths are from Ottoman times onwards. So we're not talking about 7th, 8th, 9th century, we're talking about way later. But obviously if Muslims want to argue with that, they're going to have to produce manuscripts from the time, especially these hadiths that I've pointed out. I'd like to see early versions of this. If these hadiths existed, fine. But please explain to me why in Medina, no one seems to be aware of this for 1,000 years. Why are the religious leaders not destroying these mausoleums? They've been visited by millions and millions of Muslims over the centuries, probably encouraged by the imams to go and visit Muhammad's grave, and probably considered a holy practice to do so. They're not just doing this because they are going against the religious leaders. They're obviously being encouraged by the religious leaders. They're told that this is a virtuous thing to do, except when Wahhab comes along in the 18th century and says, well, no, there's a hadith which says the opposite. So we're going to destroy these graves. And they did, and it caused a huge outcry in Saudi Arabia at the time when they destroyed all of these graves. And they did plan to destroy the grave Muhammad, and I say that with inverted commas because actually we really don't know if there was anyone in the grave or not, but the believed grave Muhammad was spared, and that's where we have it. Okay.
And I will be generous and say, there is a possibility that this hadith could have been written earlier. But that tells you something different. That tells you that it wasn't considered canonical, that it wasn't considered important. So either it existed and people didn't follow it because they didn't think it was important, or it didn't exist. Either way, the standard narrative doesn't really work.
Exactly. Yeah. So there's not too much of a get out of jail card that you can give for that one, I think. If we compare early Islamic depictions of Muhammad with later ones, we see that the idea of veiling Muhammad is a later invention. Okay, how much later? It won't surprise you to know it's the 16th centuries when we see the veiling of Muhammad coming in. So the implications of this is that any hadiths that say we must not draw Muhammad's face are from that period or later. So the painting on the ground, pardon the pun, is an indication of what actually people did and believed. And if they believe something, it's based on some form of teaching. If an hadith existed, that would have formed their beliefs, and so therefore it would have informed their practice. But the only time we start seeing it informing their practice is in the 16th century, which is, well, it's 900 years after Muhammad's time, which would indicate that this hadith was lying low for 9 centuries, if you want to believe that, and then suddenly it became a big deal, and suddenly they start veiling Muhammad. So I'm just going to give you an example here. So the picture on the left is from the 11th century. Can you see Muhammad's face there on the podium? It's quite clear, isn't it?
Yeah, you can clearly see eyes and a mustache or something. Interesting that he has a mustache, since Muslims generally don't want to have mustaches either, but that's beside the point.
Yeah.
Clearly a face there.
Yeah, so this is about 1000 AD, so you're talking about 1020 years ago, roughly. And you can see on the right, it's a bit hard to see, but basically over Muhammad's face, there's a veil. He looks like he's wearing those surgical masks of, better not say the disease that's been out for the last couple of years. But,
Whoops.
So 16th century, Muhammad's face can't be drawn. Okay. 11th century, Muhammad's face can be drawn. So the question is, when did the hadith come about that says you can't draw Muhammad's face? Did it come before the 11th century? Or did it happen in the 16th century? I would suggest that paintings would indicate it started to be published in the 16th century because it was written in the 16th century. And of course, this is when the Ottomans were really growing in power, and they're becoming more and more, because they're becoming more and more powerful, their religion is becoming more and more extreme. And one sign of that was the fact that Muhammad's face is veiled. Okay. You'll also notice that there are flames coming out of Muhammad. Can you see that? The golden flames?
Yeah. Yeah, we have a related question here from DeJordan that asks, is that a halo? And on the 11th century one, it does appear to be a traditional halo. And then the later one, it's replaced by flames of fire, which is the now traditional way to draw the equivalent of a halo.
Yeah, so I would suggest that in the 11th century, the depiction of Muhammad is based on Byzantine ideas of saints, so they would have drawn halos. The one on the right would have been influenced by Buddhist art, which is quite a remarkable source to base your artwork. If you are trying to promote a religion that is not pagan, and you are turning to what many would consider a pagan religion, Buddhism, okay? I think in some forms of Buddhism, they don't even believe in a god. I know there are some forms of Buddhism that does, but that's a very strange source to go to get the, this form of depiction. Okay. Now, another example of what we're talking about, this again is quite controversial. There's a reference in 870 to a Sarcen synagogue. Now, this clashes with our notions of early Islam. the traveller Bernard the monk visited the holy city around 870 AD and wrote that the Temple of Solomon is in the north, which houses a Sarcen synagogue. Now, monks are pretty knowledgeable about religious matters, and this has often been written off as a mistake. You know, Sarcen means Arab or Muslim. Why did he call it a synagogue? Why didn't he call it a mosque? But maybe he saw something about early Islam that indicated that it was a Jewish sect of some kind, rather than it being a completely new religion at this stage. This is, as I say, 870 AD. Note that there is no Dome of the Rock, as the Dome of the Rock would be in the center of the Temple Mount. So he's not saying that it is in the center. The Temple Mount would be in the center, not in the north. So if you look in the picture there, where the red box is, a red rectangle, that's where he says that the Temple of Solomon, which is equated with the Dome of the Rock, that's where he says it is. He should have said it's in the center. Okay. That he calls it a synagogue is not a mistake. He is a monk, not a lay person, untrained in religious matters. This clashes with the standard narrative of how Islam began. Most people believe that the Dome of the Rock was built by Abdul al-Malik in 692. And yet we have a witness here who doesn't seem to notice a Dome of the Rock in existence in 870 AD, which is nearly 2 centuries later. So that would indicate that there's something seriously amiss. Okay. Now, sometime between 870 and 897, a Dome of the Rock was built, and hey presto, a narrative is created for it. So I don't know if you've seen Star Wars, but it's basically a mind trick. They basically wave their fingers and say, "This is ancient, go about your business. There's nothing to see here," you know? And it worked. The amazing thing is, the narrative was told. The Dome of the Rock, at the time that they wrote this narrative, would have only been about 20 years old at most. People just fell in line. They just, well, it doesn't make any sense, but okay, fine. And then within a few generations, it just became part of the general standard narrative. So here is what was said. Okay, so just try and imagine that this is 28 years after this monk visited the Temple Mount. He tells us that there was a Temple of Solomon in the northern part. He says nothing about there being a dome in the central part. But here we have, in the late 9th century, the Sunni historian and geographer Yaqubi, who died in 897. And he reported in a way that is suggestive of the building having stood long enough to leave room for interpretation. But you can all read that for yourselves. But the key bit is that it says, then Abdul al-Malik built above the Sacra a dome. Now, the Sacra is the rock that is underneath the Dome of the Rock. It's the rock that's referred to when we talk about the Dome of the Rock. It is the place that was believed to be where Abraham went to sacrifice Isaac. So a very important place for Jewish people. And yet this is our very first reference to a Dome of the Rock being built. And it's, as you can see, it's very late. It's the 9th century, whereas literally only 28 years before that, we have a Christian monk who visited the Temple Mount and just says, no, there's just a building in the northern part, nothing else, and it's a Saracen synagogue. Can you see what the problem is with all of this? It means that there's massive holes in the standard Islamic narrative, and what we can see here is the beginnings of a cover story that's backdated with, it's very convincing because it's got all the names and so on, and it's got all of the circumstances around it. Looks very convincing, except the fact is earlier witnesses didn't seem to see any of this. Okay, we can be reasonably confident that at the time of 897 there was a dome, but in Abdul al-Malik's time, I would suggest not. All we can say is that a monk reported there being a Saracen synagogue in a different location. No mention of a dome, no mention of it being over the rock. He specifies that it is in the north, so that it cannot have been over the rock. Sadly, lies are readily accepted and fact-checking are rare. but there is an inscription that says it is in the dome. Sorry, I'll say that again. But there is an inscription that says it in the Dome of the Rock. Are you familiar with the idea that there's an inscription that says that Abd al-Malik built the Dome of the Rock?
Yes, and I did watch your recent video on this, so I know where you're going to go, but I won't give it away for the audience.
Okay. So our first verified witness to an inscription pertaining to who built the Dome of the Rock is actually, again, from the 16th century. You've seen a pattern here, how late all of these things are turning out to be. But even that didn't say Abd al-Malik, but Umar. So this is something it's new. I haven't heard this until this year, and we have a witness account of this inscription, thankfully, from the 16th century. So we know that this inscription did exist, but it no longer exists. Okay? And this is the inscription. It references Umar, and it's given in A.J. Juice's paper, The Jewish Serpent King. And if people want to have a look at that paper, I highly recommend it. It's quite a long paper. You can download that from Academia for free. Okay, so
do you happen to know what that inscription was written in? It looks like the text on the reverse side is probably not in Arabic, so I'm guessing that this was maybe a tourist or something that went there and recorded the
I have no idea. I don't know the full ins and outs. I think that would be probably worth inquiring into. It looks like it's a different type of script underneath, so presumably the person who transcribed what they could see in the inscription wrote it on top of.
Well, I think that's probably the reverse side of the paper coming through, because if you look, it looks like it goes the opposite direction.
Yeah.
But in any case, it's definitely not. It doesn't seem to be Arabic, so it seems to be a different text.
Yeah, at a guess, I would. Well, it could be possibly Latin, maybe, but yeah, I'm not sure. Maybe German. I'm not sure. Okay, but
no problem. If you don't know, we can just look into it later. But
yeah, it'd be worth looking into. But I suppose the key takeaway is that we have Umar's name mentioned instead of Abd al-Malik. Okay, so to summarize the additions that have occurred with the reference to who built the Dome of the Rock, it's a bit like who killed what's his name from, I don't know, do you remember the sitcom called Dallas? J.R. Ewing. There was a character who killed J.R. Ewing. It was a bit like that. Who built the Dome of the Rock here? For centuries, different people, both Muslims and non-Muslims, suggested different people who built the Dome of the Rock. There was no clarity about it. Some said it was Walid. Some said it was Umar. Some said it was Abd al-Malik. Some said it was al-Mamun. And so these inscriptions were basically trying to nail down officially who it was. And they were trying to probably get rid of the arguments around this question. But so, summary then. First, Umar was claimed as the builder of the Dome of the Rock by an inscription, no less, and this was done in the 16th century. Secondly, Abd al-Malik was claimed again as the builder of the Dome of the Rock, and this inscription was done in the 18th century. And thirdly, al-Mamun was claimed as the builder of the Dome of the Rock, though the year 72 AH was retained from the second edition. In other words, they left the anomaly between Abd al-Malik and al-Mamun. It's kind of like they split their bet between the two. And this inscription was created in the 19th century, so that's like just so recently. And interestingly, an archaeologist who visited the Dome of the Rock noticed the anomaly between al-Mamun and Abd al-Malik and thought there was something up with that. And that happened in the 19th century. So it's interesting, literally within decades of this inscription being in place, an archaeologist spotted the anomaly. Okay, so it's kind of worked, but yeah, it raised a lot of eyebrows and a lot of questions. So to try and tie it together, I think I'm going to use an IT analogy here to explain all of this. Islam is in danger of crashing and needs a complete reboot. Islam's narratives are changed at will in an iterative process akin to what occurs in software development. Bugs are found, then corrected, but these lead to further contradictions. And this has been the age-old problem. The problem is that Islam's operating system is built on DOS, when really it wants to start afresh with a completely new operating system, so that it can finally free itself from legacy software holding it back. I hope people can follow this software analogy. Shia Islam went through 12 imams, which were meant to reboot it, but failed. And the 12th imam went into occultation and is believed to return in the future to tie up all the loose ends. Sunni Islam hoped that its Sharia law would provide a comprehensive antivirus package, but that too is out of date. Islam is banking on a Mahdi operating system to save the day, the Mahdi being the Messiah, who would basically waltz in and just make it all make sense. Okay? But I would say if it doesn't make sense, it's usually not true. So there, I leave it.
Excellent. I did post the link for any Muslim who wants to come up and chat with us. I do have a few questions for you. Feel free to say you don't know or you don't have an opinion or whatever, because they're not directly related, just tangentially related. So you mentioned you mentioned that the Dome of the Rock was called, or not really the Dome of the Rock, but the building there was called a synagogue. And this would be compatible with my current line of thinking, that Islam probably started as a pseudo-Jewish sect. And I think this primarily because most of the source texts of the Quran are Jewish texts, and not just ones that would be readily available, but the kind that would only probably be read by rabbis. So what are your thoughts on that possibility, that it derives from Judaism?
Yeah, I think there's a very strong case for that. Red Judaism would argue that case as well. They obviously use Christian lectionaries in terms of what they were doing in those early days, but there seems to be a hybrid situation going on. But I would say it's hard to come down on one side or the other, but it seems to be primarily a Jewish phenomenon. And I think the monk that visited the Temple Mount could see that obviously in terms of the layout of the building and so forth. So yeah, I would go along with that.
And when would you say that something resembling modern Islam started to develop? Would that be with the Abbasids, or would that be at a different point in time?
My current view is really you're seeing what looks very like Islam today. I think we're talking about Ottoman times. So that's quite a big jump. However, if you go back to the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century, you are definitely seeing the early elements of it. But a lot of the practices were very similar to what Christians and Jews were doing, like, for example, visiting graves. Catholics would have gone to graves, they would have prayed to saints, and you can see that the Muslims were doing exactly the same thing. The way that Muslims were praying by prostrating on the floor, that was a practice that was done by Christians, so they obviously have borrowed that. So there was a lot of things that were similar. The other thing is we can see that they were comfortable with alcohol at least up to the early part of the 8th century, and then they started to prohibit alcohol. Probably around the time of the Abbasids, they started going a bit more extreme. And why that was the case, they probably needed a really strong identity. They're gradually trying to distance themselves from Judaism and Christianity. They need a reason why someone should become what they are, that's different from Christian and different from Judaism. So I think sort of the middle of the 8th century, I think they're heading towards it becoming very, very different to what was there before. And I was reading a book called The Myth of Andalusia recently, and when you look at the reports from the late late 8th century, and then the 9th and 10th century, in terms of the practices of those Muslims, whether those were, I feel like, a heretical anti-Trinitarian group, and not necessarily Islam per se at that stage, but they had really kind of extreme practices even then. So it's very hard really to put your post in the ground and say this is when Islam began, and when it's a bit like you're looking at it different stages of an embryo, and you're saying, well, when does the embryo look human now? Well, you say, well, it's got a heartbeat there. It's kind of, it's that kind of thing. I can see a skeleton now. It's there. It's a bit like that. So
Yeah. To draw a different analogy, there's considerable debate on when there was a hard break between Judaism and Christianity, and that's with a lot of data behind it. Yeah. There's a lot of sources to look at, and different people will say the break occurred here or it occurred there. So even with hard data to look at, it's not always clear when the break occurred. So I think that's a fair answer. Then we don't really know. It probably happened gradually over time, and I think that's actually probably the most important takeaway from this, is that Islam has continued to evolve. It was evolving from the time that it was really not Islam at all. It was some sort of ecumenical or Jewish movement, and it evolved a little at a time over long periods of time, and that didn't stop. It didn't stop with the Abbasids. It didn't stop with the biography of Ibn Ishaq or whenever. It's continued up to the present day, to the point where Muslims will look at when we read their own highly trusted sources to them, they're like, that's not part of Islam. What are you talking about? Because it's continued to evolve.
Yeah. I would say, let's say you were to take we'll call a Muslim from the early 8th century, and if you were to time travel them to today and show them Islam today, they would not recognize it as the same religion. They would say, what is this monstrosity of a religion? They would say, how did they get so far removed from what we believe in the early 8th century? There was a reason why Muslims saw themselves as more or less like Christians and Jews in the early days, because they were very similar. They weren't so different. Now they've become so different that it's even hard to imagine that they've come from there originally, but they were much more similar. So it's kind of like they've moved apart over the centuries,
Yeah, I just had an interesting thought. So this is off the top of my head, but I'll see what your opinion is. So there's the Hadith that Muhammad supposedly says that the first 3 generations of Muslims are the only pure ones, the best ones, however you want to phrase that. And that was, almost certainly written well after 3 generations. So would you say that that's an attempt to change what the beliefs of that time were? That they're saying our beliefs have become corrupted, so we got to go back to this stuff that we just made up?
Yeah, there's obviously an attempt to continuously in Islam to create cover stories for things that stand out like a sore thumb. So they want to explain why are there innovations, so they can say, well, in the early days things were pure. So that'll be one explanation. Or if they want to introduce something new, but that's not currently being done, well, they can say, well, we need to go back to the pure days. And Muhammad said this way back when. So, okay, people didn't know about this hadith, but no, he really did say it. We have this line of narration. So they can basically introduce a hadith at will and then allow that to become a new innovation without people thinking it's an innovation, because actually, no, this comes from the 7th century. So we're actually just going back to the way it originally was. But who's going to argue with that? If your religious leaders tell you that, and the Sharia law says that you must obey, you must not question your religious leaders, then it just becomes taken as fact, and then the reset button has been hit, and there away you go.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That the first reaction to someone would, including someone like me, would probably be like, I don't think that they really could have added things so late. Surely people would have noticed. But then you realize that the number of people who actually are familiar with from ancient times, and maybe it's a little broader now, but number of people who are actually directly familiar with what the Hadith collections say is, very, very tiny. And Islam's created this system where you're just supposed to follow the leader unquestionably. You're not supposed to think for yourself. And that probably is pretty ancient. I mean, that's even in the Quran, right?
Yeah. But if you take Ibn Taymiyyah, right? I think it was, I'm trying to remember, 14th century, I'm going to say. I think it was from the 14th century. When he came out with his views in the 14th century, he was viewed as an out-and-out heretic, a dangerous man. But pretty much all his views becomes the standard Islamic theology centuries later. So there in itself just tells you how much Islam has got away from what it was like in the early days. So his views were so out of whack with the rest of Islam in the 14th century, they thought it was appropriate to throw him into prison for the rest of his life. It's only that the fact that Wahhab took up his ideas centuries later that took off. And then Saudi Arabia then spent billions propagating this form of Islam, and that became the standard form of Islam in many countries around the world. Whereas prior to that, Islam had been a relatively, moderate religion, but then it went off on an extreme line for decades. And it's only really in the last 10 years that Saudi Arabia has tried to draw that back in and say, this is sort of untenable. We can't keep going like this. We'd like some tourists coming to our country. We need to drop the Wahhabi line and just get back to something where we can keep our people happy and actually make money. So there's a lot of that going on.
The all-powerful dollar there.
Absolutely.
So switching gears a little bit, of course, there's also the military conquests going on. How would you tie those in with the religion? Are they independent and later tied in later sources, or do the military conquests come first and then they need a justification for what they've already done, or how would you view that?
Yeah, it's good. It's a good question. I suppose one thing you have to admit, really, if you're talking about the conquests in the 7th century, a large number of the people who were taking part in the conquests amongst the Arabs were Christians. That's something that's overlooked. Whatever was there, whatever sect existed in the 7th century, they would have been the minority. And if they didn't have the Christian majority on board with that, they would have never succeeded because they were just outnumbered. Okay, so what was driving them? Well, what was driving them is the fact that they were snuggled between the Byzantines and the Persians, right? And they're getting really ticked off between the wars that were going on between both sides, and they're the buffer zone. And so they had a very strong political incentive to basically to fight against both and basically win their independence. And religion doesn't really play much of a role. People would have taken advantage of this military conquest and put religious meaning onto it, which is always something that happens. If we take the situation with Russia and the Ukraine, the Orthodox leader Kirill is providing religious defense for the military conquest of the Ukraine. That's always kind of religion, unfortunately, plays a part in a lot of these things, because without that, without a religious ideology, it's very hard to motivate people to risk their lives for something. People will rarely risk their lives for the sake of something that doesn't particularly affect their own family. But if you can create an ideological construct, narrative, whatever, then you could motivate people to get involved in a war and risk their lives for a bigger cause. So that's where the religion thing came in. But I think the evidence on the ground in the 7th century is the coins have crosses on them. And so we're talking about in all the places that you'd expect there to be references to Islam, we see crosses. And it's only, I think it's the 680s is when you see the first reference to a Shahada. And then you have obviously more clear references to what looks like Islam in Abdul al-Malik's time. But for decades there, you'd be hard pressed to say this was Islam happening on the ground. There's very little evidence. But that's not to say there wasn't some sect that is arguing for some form of hybrid between Judaism and Christianity, where Jesus is presented as something less than divine, some form of servant of God. But that's a long way short of Islam. But you can see how that could be the nucleus of what developed later.
Very good. I will add that there's at least one coin with Jewish symbolism on it that also has the Shahada printed on it.
Right. Oh, wow.
So another question I have for you is, do you know when the earliest reference to the AH dating system began or comes from?
Yeah, I can't remember offhand. I remember discussing that about maybe 2.5 years ago. And I would have to look
long time ago.
A long time ago, yeah. So I would have to look that up. But basically, from memory, the earliest inscriptions would have had originally said in the year of the Arab. It wouldn't have been in the year of the Hijrah. The year of the Hijrah came in. It wouldn't have come in within the first century. We're talking about at least a century, if not later. But I may be wrong on that because obviously it's a long time ago. But essentially, for the first few decades, there's no reference to the Hijrah. That's a later invention. So you see the year of the Arab. Again, that kind of fits in with what I've just said about the fact that it's primarily a political thing. So it's about Arab independence from the Byzantines and the Persians.
So then would 622 be the founding of the political movement? Is that what you're suggesting?
Yeah, now there's dispute about when exactly it started. There is actually a reference to 618 as let me just make sure I got it right. Like see the 617, 618 as well in some narratives around that. So now that the mismatch between 618 and 622 might be to do with the type of year that's been used, whether it's a lunar year or solar year, and so maybe it just matches up and it's the same year it started. But I think it's got to do with the beginning of the rebellion by the Arabs. They basically they fought against the Persians and the Byzantines, and that marked the beginning of that independence.
That makes a lot of sense. If the audience has any questions, please put those in the chat. And reminder, I did put up the link if someone wants to join us live. But if no questions come up in the next couple minutes, this I think will be my last question.
Okay.
And that's, so there's a number of historical non-Islamic sources that also talk about this period of time. The earliest ones don't mention a figure named Muhammad, but they do seem to think that there's a new religious movement starting. And then the later add in the name Muhammad, but they kind of have the same message. So my question to you is, how would you tie in these non-Islamic history sources with what you've suggested today?
Yeah, it's a bit of a mess, to be honest with you. The narrative is very confused, and I haven't really got to the full bottom of it. I've looked into Chinese sources, and in the Chinese sources, it basically suggests that there was a leader of the Tayyaye in Iraq who was responsible for that rebellion that we spoke about, whether it be 622, 618. There is a reference in 634 to the Tayyaye of Muhammad. Okay, so that's our earliest one. The problem is that according to the standard Islamic narrative, Muhammad died 2 years before. But in this reference, which is given by Thomas the Presbyter, Muhammad seems to be just starting his mission. He's fighting east of Gaza. Now, the word Muhammad in that context is confused. Some would say that it refers to a person. Some would say that it's a group. Muhammad may refer to the Temple Mount. So there's lots of possibilities. I do think it probably refers to a person myself. But the interesting thing, it's not the Quraysh of Muhammad. It's referring to the Tayyaye of Muhammad. So that there is another mismatch. But it would seem to me that the person who started the rebellion back in 622 and the person who's invading Israel or Palestine is probably not the same person, because there's loads of narratives that basically have a group of people, the Rashidun figures, and the problem is I cannot get those people to match up. There's something wrong with the dating. Red Judaism has suggested that the person referred to as Muhammad in that context might be Umar, and I think that's a very compelling case. But what's interesting is that from Umar onwards, it doesn't appear to be that these are Islamic figures. They may have been from a hybrid sect, but the fact that when they do start printing coins or stamping coins, whatever, they have crosses, which is not what you'd expect. If Islam is saying that Muhammad was against Christianity and against the cross, that's the last thing you would expect. So that just shows you how much of the narrative is bogus. And the title today was the fact that Islam is fake, and that's what the evidence tells you. But
actually, that's another good example of a hadith that couldn't possibly come from Muhammad, right? There's several hadith about Jesus coming back and breaking the cross and so forth. Specifically saying the cross is a forbidden symbol, and yet we have, 50, 70 years of presumed Islamic coins that have cross symbols on them.
Yeah.
So we did have one question from Coco here. Do you have any idea how Kabbalah and Kaaba of Allah could be linked? It sounds so similar, but where could the link be? So I would caution against thinking that just because something sounds similar that they're related. But do you have any more specific information about that?
No, I don't think there's any link. I think it's one of those things that maybe the etymology might have some similarities, but I don't think there's any direct link there. Yeah.
I would say that in the theory that Islam evolved out of a pseudo-Jewish sect, it probably was related to mysticism, but the Kabbalah mysticism comes later. It hadn't really developed yet in the 8th century.
Yeah, I don't know too much about that. I think Colin would be the person to ask about that. He knows a lot about that. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if that's something that's brought in much later into it. I suppose something I could have brought up in relation to that Jewish link is the fact that if we take two places in Mecca, Safa and Marwa, if we look to Jerusalem, what do we find? Well, we find that Mount Moriah, where the Temple Mount is, if you pronounce Moriah in Hebrew, in its Arabic form, what you get Mount Marwa. So there's your Marwa. And then if we looked across to Mount Scopus, well, it's alternatively referred to as Safa, as far back as 2,000 years ago. So we have Jewish links even in the monuments in Mecca that are linked there. So that again indicates a Jewish origin.
Villainous said he had a question earlier. I have not been able to find that scrolling up. So if you could repeat that, please. But in the meantime, we do have an off-topic question. Do you expect apostasy to reach 50% in the West within our lifetime?
Can you be more specific? Do you mean apostasy among Christians or?
Well, I would assume he means among Muslims.
I think it's probably reached 50% among Christians, but I would say that and higher. I think it could be really like off the cliff stuff. You could be talking 75% and higher.
Yeah, I would agree. See, the problem, we have a couple reasons to believe that. We tend to think that people don't change their religious beliefs, and it's really hard for someone to apostatize. But I would point to two things. I'd point one to the 18th and 19th century developments in Christianity, where these scholarly views started to filter down to the public. And even though they really shouldn't have been damaging to Christianity, it caused massive doubt among the population. And now Christians have good answers for this, but the church wasn't prepared. This was all new information. So for a period of time, people were really in this area where it seemed like Christianity was falling apart. And a lot of people left the church at that time. And I think that's what's happening right now with Islam. This is the first time in history that these scholarly ideas are starting to filter down to the public, and people are seeing that what they believe isn't really matching up with reality. And I don't think there's any answers. I don't think that no matter how much research you do into Islam, you're ever going to come up with any good answers. Yeah. And then I go ahead.
I would just add to that I think one of the key things in the 19th century as well, on top of what you said, is that there were new narratives that better explain things for Christians, like, for example, the theory of evolution. And so that made perfect sense. It was nice and simple, easy to understand, or even though people probably had a child's understanding of it, but it kind of made ready sense. So it wasn't just cold hard facts. It was actually a story that could be told, that you could hear and you go, oh right, so we evolved from this, okay. And then they looked at the biblical story and they couldn't tie the two things together. So one of those two propositions had to go. Now I think what we're not very good at in dealing with Islam is we're not very good at offering a counter narrative. We've been giving them little bits of facts and making them question things, but I think where it will get really exciting is when we actually offer a coherent counter narrative. We're very close to that. And I've kind of been hesitant about coming forward too much with a narrative, because I think the danger is that you go a bit too fast and then have to correct your narrative in light of new evidence. But we're getting very close. The sin sifters that the group that I'm a member of, there's I think there's about 7 or 8 of us altogether. We're all working at this from different angles, and sometimes we disagree with each other, but there's a kind of a core part of what we're all concluding on that seems to be well founded. And eventually we're going to come to an agreed narrative about how Islam began. And I think once that's in place, I think that will be a very damaging thing for Islam, because ordinary Muslims, when they hear the narrative, they will just readily get it, and the penny will drop. It just has to. They just need to. It's a very human part of our nature that we live by stories. If we get a clear story that explains something, that's when the penny drops, and you don't survive the story. If the story makes sense, the old story that does no longer make sense will be dropped, which, that's what I think will happen.
Yeah, excellent point there, that as long as we're just pointing things out that are problems and not offering something to replace it, it's kind of like, well, I see the problems, but I don't have a better alternative, right? So maybe Islam is still true, and you're just not seeing things right. I think you're right. Once we have that, comprehensive alternate story about how all these things came to be, that's when people will really start to be like, yeah, this doesn't hold up to scrutiny.
Yeah.
So closed. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say that one group that's really making headways in that whole area is the Inara group in Germany. And Dr. Robert Kerr is the leader of that. And I think I'm free to say that we'll be seeing more of him soon on many YouTube channels. So look out for him. He's going to be coming on board. He loves what we're doing. He's very much in favor, even though we're the amateurs, but I think we've encouraged a lot of the academics to come out of the woodwork and actually come on and make videos and share their knowledge, because an awful lot of their knowledge is hidden away in papers that no one ever reads.
Yeah, and I think that what we're also doing is showing that you can talk about these things in public without risking your lives. And, that's just another example of the Islamic political dominance, that they've created this idea that merely talking about facts it could be dangerous. So there's this hesitancy from people doing this research to actually make it well known in public. So we'll close out with this question from Villainous. Do we have much Christian documentation from the Spanish Umayyad period to get a third-party view?
We do and we don't. The unfortunate thing is an awful lot was destroyed in the conquest of Spain. So they were lucky to even to have any of their churches still standing from that time. So if you imagine relics, churches, you name it, and Christians were all killed and destroyed and damaged and so on. So a lot has been destroyed. There is a chronicle from, I'm going to say, the 750s. I can't remember the name of it. I can't remember the name of it offhand, but it gives a certain version of events which explains some of it, but it doesn't. It's not comprehensive enough, in my view. But I think we don't have enough evidence, or as much evidence as we would like. We'd always like more, and there's a good chance there's an awful lot of evidence that's hidden away in documents somewhere that haven't been translated. So I'm hoping on that.
Yeah, and we're also working against the Islamic texts that encouraged people to destroy non-Islamic writings as well.
Yeah.
So thank you all for joining us today. I think this was a great stream, very informative. If you'd like to learn more about early Islam, be sure to subscribe to Origins. A link to that is in the video description. I'll have him on again at some point. He's a very busy guy. Hard to get him on here sometimes, but I would definitely like to have him on to update his research periodically. A couple previous streams with him on this channel, and if you look at those, you're going to see something very different because, like I said, he's open to change his ideas, open to change his mind. So if any Muslims who watch this later, they have some evidence that we should be considering, please put it in the chat. If you just have empty rhetoric, don't waste our time. Have a great week, everyone. I'll be live again in an hour and 20 minutes, so tune in for that. God bless.